Good morning, everybody. About a year ago, President Hu Jintao and President Zelek of the World Bank got together and thought it was useful for the two teams to think about China 2030. How could China chart its way to become a harmonious society, a high-income society? How could it meet these ambitions, and what were the actions it should be taking? And they decided to put up a group and think about it, sort of strategic thinking. It had 5 pillars. One was green growth, another was innovation, was one about the role of China in the world, one sort of the macro issues, and another one on social issue, education, and health. And as part of the preparation or part of this process, one background paper to that was on the role of agriculture, on the role of food. Surprisingly, that didn't get as much attention as I personally would have thought, but nonetheless, this was part of one of the green growth pillar. And of course, a lot has been written about food and China. Can China feed itself is a recurring theme. Every so often there's a whole slew of papers about that topic because it is a big challenge. It's about 1.3 billion people. How can they feed themselves? They have indeed a lot of people. They don't have a lot of land compared to the rest of the world, or relatively speaking. So it is a challenging topic. But at the same time, in thinking about the role of agriculture, what this background piece tried to do was take a much more comprehensive role and sort of a dynamic role, and look at the evolving role of agriculture in the development of China as it charts its way to become a high-income society. And this, of course, resonates quite well with the theme of the conference. And as we all know, agriculture is probably one of the oldest businesses in the world, of one of the oldest professions in the world, that is agriculture. So this is sort of the background to that. And I think resonating very much with the other speakers, if you think about the role of agriculture, first thing we think about is food. What is a key role of agriculture? To make sure that there's enough food in the country, to supply the country, to supply its people with food, to make sure they're not hungry. That's sort of one overriding theme. But in doing that, it also generates income for the producers. So another key role is to make sure that the farmers have a decent income, have an income which is comparable with what you could earn outside. If not, they're not going to be keeping on the farm. They're not going to keep farming. So that's sort of a second role. And the third role is agriculture, of course, a major user. And as some have already said, sometimes even a major abuser of the natural resource environment. So how it interacts with its environment, with its natural resource base, is equally critical. To put 3 other buzzwords on it, it's about the efficiency, sort of the aggregate supply, the total output. It's about equity, it's about the incomes, the social aspects, and it's about sustainability. And as countries develop, the relative emphasis which is put on each of these 3 roles tends to change. And while there are, of course, win-wins, often it's more about trade-offs. That's where the hard choices are being made. And that's sort of what often the debate is about. And early on in the development, when people from the countries are poor, the focus is on getting that food supply up, producing enough food for the country, making sure that there are no hungry people, solving the food and clothing problem, as they say it in China. And that's indeed what China has been doing, sort of from the early, like 1980, 2000 onward. The big focus was on food, getting agriculture productivity up, getting its food supply up. The income was sort of came along with it because as the farmers, mostly small farms, as they produced more food, they also got more income. They weren't too concerned about the environment at that point in time. That was not their overriding objective. Now, as this goes on, a second problem starts to come up. As China became more successful in producing more food, at the same time, at the beginning, agriculture was sort of the engine of growth, I would even dare to say here, and it's definitely been the major contributor, the most important contributor to poverty reduction in China, which has been massive, as we all know, and there are many studies proving that. But as that happened, the non-agriculture sector became the more important driver of growth, and is the more important driver of growth now, and as a result, incomes in this non-agriculture sector grew much faster. So you got an increasing gap between the incomes in the farm sector and the incomes outside the farm sector. So you get rising inequality. And people feel left behind. And that's a major issue which starts to to happen and drive agriculture policy making in that transformation. It's a process we have seen all across the world, in Europe, in other East Asian countries, in the US. So this rising gap between the two sources of income. So we basically get a farm income problem as a major driver of agricultural policy, and how agriculture can contribute to resolving that becomes a major issue. It's not about absolute poverty, it's about relative poverty. And then you could argue, as sort of these problems tend to get resolved, then you get more urbanization, you get shifts in mindsets, and sort of the field problems, the environmental problems, get more prominence. And that's sort of, you could argue, sort of where we're looking, or where we are right now is sort of in that middle ground. And just to illustrate that, and sort of moving towards a third picture. To illustrate the critical importance of this farm income problem, the fact that basically farm incomes aren't going up as fast as incomes outside agriculture is clearly indicated by this graph. What does this graph tell you? It's basically the difference in the average income between the urban and the rural. And the blue line gives you the ratio. And so if in the it started out quite high, 1978, that's when the reforms in China started, it was around a factor 3. Decreased quite a bit, because that's indeed when they introduced the household responsibility system, and farms could start to sell their own produce on the markets and thus keep the profits themselves, or part of the profits themselves. That gave a big boost to agriculture, a tremendous decline in poverty. About half of the reduction in poverty in China can be ascribed to that first 6-7 years. And so that ratio declined. But since then, it has been creeping up. Now, it has been leveling off since sort of 2005, around the fact between closely 3.3, 3.4. But at the same time, while the ratio is leveling off, and this is partly as a result also of policy implication or policy responses, while the ratio is leveling up in absolute levels, and that's the red line, that has grown exponentially. And it's now about 12,000 to 1 difference between the average rural and the average urban income, because these average urban incomes tend to grow much faster than the rural incomes. Now, how do you solve that? What are responses? One response is that too many people in the rural sector, so you move the people out of the rural sector. And that's actually exactly what's happening during the structural transformation. As the economies grow, they restructure, agriculture becomes less important in relative terms. It keeps growing in absolute terms, but it becomes less important in relative terms, which in a way is the flip side of the consumption pattern. As people get richer, they spend less as a share of their income on food, although they spend more in absolute terms, they spend less as a share. Sort of that's the flip side of that. That also means that in principle, you need less people in agriculture, assuming that they're more productive. So you get more output for the same person. So moving out of the farm is exactly what should be happening. That's what you observe all across. The question is at what speed, and the question is where to. Should they all go to the big cities, or should they go to more of them go to smaller towns? And sort of what type of urbanization pattern gives you the most inclusive growth pattern? So that's sort of one way forward. The second one is the number of people who won't be able to move. They will be left behind. How can we mitigate their living conditions? So the whole important role of safety nets. And the third is what's the role of agriculture in this? And that's what this presentation will talk more about. So modernizing this agriculture and what organizational form of agriculture, small versus larger farms, can help facilitate this transition. So against this background, sort of looking forward, we put forward the following vision for China's agriculture 2030, where China's agriculture would be organized on part-time and commercial smallholder farms that will provide self-sufficiency in strategic staples, and these are rice and wheat. It will provide a viable living to a large number of rural people, focused on labor-intensive, high-value products, and that will act as diligent custodians of China's precious natural resources. And let's sort of walk through where we are now, what are the challenges, and what sort of policy package would help realize such a vision. What's the structure of agriculture now? Structure of production. I think there's just no doubt. China has been tremendously successful in its agriculture. Output has been growing at 4.6% if you take from 78 to now. That's unprecedented in history. Growing at 4% per year. I challenge you to look at the statistics and find 10 countries in the world to do that over time. keeping doing that. I mean, you'll find episodes of 4% all over. But doing that for 30 years in a row is unprecedented, is a tremendous achievement. So no doubt about it. Now, as that happened, we also saw a shift in the structure of that production. And sort of on the cereal side, what's interesting, let's just focus on cereals for the time being. We saw basically that at the beginning, this is total output. Beginning, we saw wheat, rice, and corn all going up. But then actually sort of around 2000, rice, this is total output, total rice and wheat production actually started to decline. There was sort of a saturation in the staples. There was enough staples, if you wish. At the same time, you saw corn production going up all the time. Because at the same time, people were moving out of the core staple grains into eating meat. And for meat, you need grains in addition to other feed. So basically, corn became an important, that keeps on growing to feed the animals for meat consumption. Now, at the same time, while this sort of, over time, they doubled about the total grain output in this 30-year period. At the same time, we also saw incredibly fast growth in meat production, fish production, and lately also dairy milk production. We see a slowing down of the meat production in growth rates, but let there be no mistake, this is on a larger base. So basically, in absolute terms, there's still quite a bit more meat production going on. And I'm telling you this because a lot what we hear about, the rising food prices is China's dietary shifts, India's dietary shifts. So while you see the growth rates going down here, the base is a lot larger, so you do need more meat in total in absolute terms. So basically, we see a shift. We see a shift in the agriculture structure from cereals to more and more livestock production and also fish production. China is the largest fish aquaculture exporter in the world. I think 60–70% of total aquaculture production comes from China. So basically now we have a structure where about 50% of total agriculture output is cereals, about 30% is 35% is livestock, and about 10% is aquaculture. Now, all this is happening on extremely small farms. The average farm size right now is 0.6 hectares. It started from 0.78, went down, kept on going down to 2003. This is extremely small, 0.55 in 2002, so it has edged up slightly since then. Not only are these small farms, extremely small farms, on top of it, each farm consists of quite scattered plots. So basically, as China redistributed its land and continued redistributing its land in response to population growth and migration out of the rural areas, typically each household gets a couple of plots close to the homestead for gardening, a couple of plots for cereals, a bit further, and then a couple of plots further for livestock or feed production. But there's also another interesting thing which is happening, and sort of often you drive around and you wouldn't really see that these are all small fields. It would look to you, especially in the plains, it would look to you as one big plot. Only during harvest time you'll see that basically they're harvesting, you see one plot, one stripe of land, if you wish, is sort of harvested a bit further than the other one. And so that's where you start to see that they're actually separate plots, but they look from the outside as one big plot. It's interesting, and I'll come back to that, sort of what that means for the organization of production later on. But basically, we have, in sum, you basically have a production which increased tremendously, almost double total grain output. They have a dramatic restructuring of that production structure, so from really focused on crops, and particularly grains, mainly food grains, so shifting out of food, cereals, so rice and wheat, to soybeans and maize becoming more important. They went beyond grains to include and grow much more high-value crops, vegetables and fruits. And they also went beyond crops to livestock and aquatic products. Now, interestingly enough, and I didn't highlight that, while rice and wheat went down sort of around the millennium, they have sort of started to edge upward. And this is in line. This is basically in response to the rising prices, which started, the food price, the world food prices started to rise sort of around the turn of the century. So China has been following in response to these rising food prices as well. So in a way, while the food problem was resolved, the idea of being able to feed their own people with their own production in a self-sufficiency way has come back as higher on the agenda. So you have a resurfacing of the food problem in addition to the farm income problem and the field problems as challenges ahead. But I'll come to that. So, and another key point on the production structure is smallholder farming on tiny and scattered plots. Now, this is a big success. What have been the drivers of this success? And it's important to quickly go through that to see what the challenges are and how much this can still be driving success in the future. Basically, most of the success has been driven by total factor productivity growth. Originally, largely through institutional reforms to the household production system, the household responsibility system, between 78 and 84. And after that, through land-saving technologies, green revolution type technologies, better varieties, and water. Now, this has continued throughout the mid-2000s, and these are just different graphs, different studies to point that out. Now, another interesting fact is that actually most of these farms are actually producing efficiency. So one way to think about efficiency and look at gaps is to say, look, if we look at the best farmers in the neighborhood, what sort of best farming practices, and how many of the other farmers are sort of below that best frontier, that best practice. And in China, typically most of these farmers are producing quite close to that frontier, quite close to common practices known in the area. And most of the TFP growth has come from pushing that frontier. So doing new technologies and sort of bringing everybody back up. To compare this with Africa, just to give you some comparators, in China, people would on average be 80% of the frontier, so 20% away. In Africa, finding 60% or 40% away from the frontier is quite common. So basically, it's not by doing better what we are doing that you're going to have been improving their output, but really by bringing new technologies, bringing new ways of doing it. Of course, expansion of irrigation has been part of that, water control, and about half of the area is now, half of the cultivated area has been irrigated now. Now, as you can see, that expansion started early on, but has continued a bit from about 50 or 45 million hectares to about 55, 60 right now. And water use, when I talk irrigation, we talk water use. The previous speaker talked a lot about that. Again, an interesting fact to keep in mind as we move forward is that in the north, half of that water for irrigation comes from the soil. In the south, where there's much more water, it really comes more from surface irrigation. And as we go on, we'll see why this is important. In the north, you have a lot of cereal production using pumped irrigation, but the water levels are declining rapidly, and we'll come back to that. So we have TFP growth, the main thing, total factor productivity growth, better technology, green revolution, better water use, or more water use, rather not so much better, but definitely more water use. At the same time, they have opened up their domestic output and input markets, so the product markets and the fertilizer seed markets, and basically the markets are totally integrated right now, which fosters specialization, and we can also see that happening. Then sort of from the beginning of this millennium, they have also opened up to the international market. They joined WTO. 2001, China joined the WTO. And as that happened, we also saw a shift in China from being an exporter of agricultural products to becoming an importer of agricultural products. Now, basically, China has been aligning itself with its comparative advantage. It has about 35% of the world's agricultural laborers. It has about 20% of the world's population, but it has only 11% of land and 6% of the world's water. Putting that differently, it does not have, in a world, if you think about a world system, it does not have a comparative advantage in products which are land or water intensive. It does have a comparative advantage in products which are labor intensive. Now, as it happens, cereals are land and water intensive. Now, China, of course, wants to feed itself. It doesn't want to depend on the US or Europe or any other country for its food. for that matter, nor does the EU or the US wants to depend on any other country for its basic staples. So it's not different in that regard. But it has to do so with a resource base which is much more challenged, if you wish, than definitely the US, which has much more land. Europe is another case again. But as it opened up to trade, it has basically aligned itself more, and it's now basically exporting more high-value crops, which are the fruits and vegetables, which are much more labor-intensive, which can be grown on much less land, and also tend to be much better water users, or more effective user of the amount of water available. So that's another important tendency, and we'll come back to that. So drivers of success, we have land saving, total factor productivity growth. So it's not through machinery, it's through growing more on the same amount of land. Water control, better, more integrated markets, competitive input and output markets, and international trading pattern that aligned itself with its comparative advantage, opening up to the world. But this is all happening while the factor markets, land, labor, credit, capital, are still quite distorted. So that's sort of where we are today in terms of the success. Now, if you look forward, what are sort of some of the challenges? I think we have rising supply constraints, and they're rapidly rising, and at the same time there's sort of an interesting demand dynamics which has some relieves some of the pressure, but also brings on new pressures. What's the easiest way to increase production? Is to use more land. That's what we have been doing, is pushing the land frontier. Now, it's not possible in China. There's just no more land left, so to speak. Plus, there's increasing competition on that land. And that has resulted in sort of the red line which the president has put in. We are going to preserve 120 million hectares of land for agriculture purposes. So the red line. So, yes, we need more, but we don't have more land. On top of that, that land, the quality of that land is going down. It's land degradation, soil erosion, especially in the western parts of the country. Use more water. Ain't possible. There's no more room for increasing production by more water use. There's a declining water availability per person. On top of that, and that's important, it's unevenly distributed. Basically, quite a bit of the cereal production is happening in the northern part of the country. Not the rice, but all the other cereals, the wheat, the soybeans, the corn. And yet that's through pump irrigation, and that's where the water tables are declining at 3 meters per year. So there is a problem. There's a serious problem. Half of the water-using communities reports challenges using groundwater levels, seawater groundwater levels declining. Now, one solution is an engineering solution, which is happening, where basically we transport the water from the south to the north. So we build huge canals, which is happening, to transport the water from the south to the north. But in line with the Well initiative, what's interesting actually, a lot of the food comes actually from the north to the south. Now, to grow a crop, you need water. So basically, we're transporting water from the south to the north and bring it back in the form of food. And the amount of water we can transport is sort of the amount of water we bring back through food. Just to give you an idea of the challenges ahead, and sort of maybe you need to also, to some extent, think about the reallocation of the production patterns. Sort of water is a challenge. Now, at the same time, there's clearly a lot of scope for using the water more efficiently. Water use inefficiency is quite high. It's about half of the efficiency what you find in other countries. So the good news is that there's a lot of scope. But the bad news is that we can't use more water. We can't also use more fertilizer. That has been the trick in the past. China is the largest fertilizer user already in the world, 340 kilograms per hectare. It's not possible. Now, again, there's good news there, because basically they could produce the same amount of crops with 30% less nutrient use. Now, that's not easy to do, but technically that's possible. I mean, there's a lot of behavioral issues there. Why are they using what they're using, and how do you change behaviors? But technically, and there are many studies led by DFID, that basically in many areas you could do less. Using less, you could also save costs with less input use. Now, these are sort of the old techniques. It's a TFP increase, land increase, so water and fertilizer, these are the old things. But the new challenges, it doesn't stop there. And I think this is the major new thing which is on the horizon, which hasn't really been discussed. Labor costs are rising. becoming more expensive to hire somebody. It's actually, that puts a whole new dimension on this whole debate. What it means is that if labor becomes more expensive, then you want to substitute it by capital. You want to bring in machines. Now, remember we had these tiny plots? Remember, not only were they tiny, they were scattered. That's number one. So how do you deal with that? On top of that, to capture the increasing economies of scale from the machine, because a machine you can't divide, it's an indivisible input, so you get economies of scale. So you need a larger farm, principle, to capture these economies of scale, which comes with the switch to capital. Now, on top of that, so that's sort of one pressure. So the pressure for mechanization, while you have this structure of smallholder agriculture on scattered plots. On top of that, now, the farmer, why would you keep farming? The people are actually leaving the farms. You see the villages emptying out. Because it's much better to earn a living somewhere else. You can earn much more. Why would I stay on the farm if I can earn much more somewhere else? So just to make sure that the farming generates a living which is commensurate with what you could earn elsewhere, you have a second pressure to either increase the farm so that per hectare you have more hectares to get a similar income, or you move towards part-time farming where possible. And there are some striking numbers. I did some simple calculations to sort of illustrate this. And basically, between 2003 and 2008, the amount you earned per hectare rise went up to 2,600 RMB. Now, of these 2,600, 600 came from subsidies already. Actually, another 90 because of the abolishment of the taxes. No more taxes of agriculture. So you shift away from taxing agriculture to finance industrialization to now supporting agriculture. You shift the resource flow from the rural to the urban areas, now from the urban areas back to the rural areas. This is what's happening all across the world. This is what OECD-type agriculture policies are about. This is what subsidization is about. This is how to keep these farmers and give them an income which is commensurate with what you could earn out of the farm to make sure that people keep producing the food. Otherwise, you can't be self-sufficient. Major dilemma. So this 2,600 over 5 years' time, that's a substantial increase. Now, food prices have gone up quite a bit as well. Now, but there's nothing with what it was compared. Now, this is 2,600 per hectare. Average family or average farm is 0.6 hectare. So that corresponds to about 1,380 RMB per household increase if you have only 0.6 hectare. So either to keep up with what you could have earned, the increase in the rural incomes, which was about 8,500 RMB, to do the same, you either had the farm of 3.7 hectares, which is 6 times larger, or you made sure that 5 farmers left in that 5-year period to keep a farm, to get one farmer with the same amount of land. Now, it isn't all that stark as I'm putting it here, but just if you look at these numbers, it's quite clear there's tremendous pressure on the smallholder structure to make sure, especially in the cereal farm, there are many solutions. They could go to vegetables. They don't have to produce rice alone. They could do part-time farming, which is happening. 40% of the income of the Chinese farms comes from off the farm. There's lots of migration. Temporary migration, 200 million people floating around, basically leaving the farm, coming back, leaving the farm, coming back. So they're supplementing their income with off-farm income. But clearly, there is pressure on demand side, on the farm side. This is what you find all across the world. This is an example from the US. And you also see this is sort of starting to show itself. Farm size is edging up. Now, at the same time, it's important to see that you can't just change this farm size overnight unless you do. Meaning, and in China you do that, and it's actually happening, you basically take a village and turn it into a company-run farm and compensate to some extent. And the farmers are moved towards the edge of the village, they get a housing, they get an allowance, etc. Now, and that is sort of happening. We have no idea how massive that is, how big it is, what the consequences really are going to be for the farmers in the long run, but that's what's happening. The pressure is on. This is not, it doesn't stop there. This is just labor. What about the RM? This is another example that machinery, sort of mechanization is happening. But the pressure is not only on from the rising labor cost, which is new. We also have RMB. appreciation, meaning it becomes cheaper to import food because your currency becomes richer, so it becomes cheaper to import food, or the competition, the international competition, the competition of exporters on your domestic market becomes more prevalent. Fascinating things happening here. You can see that basically soybeans, China went from importing no soybeans in the mid-90s to about 55 to 60 million tons of soybeans today, in a period of 15 years. At the beginning, this came from Brazil. The Cerrado has been expanded. About 30 million tons from Brazil of soybeans are coming to China to feed the animals. Remember, people are eating more meat, so that's what they need. They need to eat something. And China has let go of its self-sufficiency in soybeans. They're now ready to import the soybeans and rely on the world market for the soybeans to feed their animals. They choose to grow the animals at home. They could also import the meat. But animal production is a labor-intensive activity and thus generates a lot of employment in the rural countryside, which helps farmers to actually gain a living which is commensurate with what you could gain outside the farm. Otherwise, everybody would move to the city. You don't want that either. You want some of that. You want to manage that pace. So that's one element. Now, US soybeans have been supplying to Chinese market since the mid-2000s. 2005, 2006, over the past 4 or 5 years, US exports of soybeans went up dramatically. This sort of coincides with the RMB being around 7.8. Now, with this graph on the right-hand side, you see the domestic price, when is the export or US soybeans, these are the bars, at which rate of the RMB, so 7.8 RMB to the dollar, at which rate are they competitive? It's around that time US started to import. Today, China is importing about 4 million tons of corn. Today, the RMB is about 6.3. That's when it's competitive. And China hasn't been importing corn for the past decade. We're exporter of corn, between 3 to 50 million tons over the past decade. It has been going down over the past 5, 6 years because they need more corn to feed their animals. So basically, they can't keep up. Corn production is going up. It's going up. But demand's going up faster. So they're importing it. Now, that's a major decision. Do you want to let go of grain self-sufficiency? Do you want to let go of corn self-sufficiency? Do you want to rely on the world market for your supply of corn? What if the US shuts down? What if they go into biofuels? Will the corn be there? Food prices are going up, double-digit inflation in China in food prices. People aren't happy. So it's a major dilemma, and that's sort of one of the issues. On top of that, to round it all off, we have climate change. Now, overall, the predictions aren't too dire, but it will induce shifts in the production patterns. And that's sort of still ongoing. Good news on the demand side is that people are actually eating less cereals. They're eating less rice, less wheat. Something I didn't know when I started this. But an urban Chinese, it's about 1/3 of the rice of the rural counterpart. So basically the pressure on that side is off. So that's good news. But the pressure really comes from the animal feed side. Now that also has some advantages because it may be politically less sensitive. It's one thing to say that you have to rely on a rice market for your rice supply, a rice market which is not deep, which is much more political, than to rely on a corn market which is deeper, more developed, etc. But clearly demand side there's still a lot of demand for meat and so I want to highlight 2 policy responses to round off. And sort of what we are sort of putting forward is, indeed, given these pressures on land, water, environment, add to that the RMB, potential climate change, and especially the labor costs, that China may indeed want to let go of trying to be self-sufficient in cereal at all costs, meaning in corn. I'm particularly peculiar about corn, because corn is mainly an animal feed. It's politically less sensitive. If you can't get the corn, you could probably still get the meat. If you can't get the corn, you could still get the potatoes. Actually, they could grow potatoes. And this is exactly what I've done with soybeans. And this graph is quite illuminating in this regard. What this graph is about the water which is in the plants. And basically, it's about the evapotranspiration. So as a plant grows, water flows through the plant. So the amount of water per kilogram is what's on the horizontal axis. And if you see to the right there, you see soybeans there. 3,500 liters of water evapotranspirated through the plant, through the course of the growth of that plant, per kilogram of soy. Now, it's also soybeans that they started to import first. Now, this may be pure coincidence, but soybeans are also grown in the north, and that's where the water challenges are largest. So basically, not only is China importing 50 to 60 million tons of soybeans, they're importing massive amounts of water. If China is going around the world for land, it's not just going for land, it's going for water. And that's what they're doing. And why are we sort of advising, and why is it also happening, to also relax on corn? Because corn, as a cereal, is also quite water intensive. Not as bad as soybeans. It's not 3,500 liters per kilogram, but it's around 1,000 liters per kilogram. So not only would they get corn, they would also get a lot of water. And water is scarce, and it's one way to solve the problem. This time at a global level, as opposed to sort of within a water-based management. And then finally, there's a whole issue, and we can go back in what does that mean for the world market? If China would import more corn, many people are concerned about that. What does it mean for China? Can they do that? Is it safe to rely on the world market for corn? It's not so obvious, maybe a political risk, so we can talk in the discussion. The final point I want to make is, we talked about the smallholders, so clearly they need to get bigger, but you can't just change it overnight. And as you know, land is owned by the commune, it's not owned by the farmer. They get land user rights. There's still quite a bit of remaining uncertainty about whether they will have the land or whether it won't be redistributed. So that may prevent some investment. So as a result, land rental is happening a bit, but getting more secure land tenure rights, getting land certification, can help facilitating the land rental as a starting point before we start talking about private land ownership, which is politically a much more radical proposition in the Chinese context. So that's sort of one element. Because TFP is critical, of course, but TFP growth at 2%, as we've observed over the past 3 decades, which is high even by industrialized country standards. So while 2% helps, GDP is growing at 9%, so you still have quite a gap to close. So farm consolidation will have to be part of the answer, one way or the other. And sort of land rental, land certification programs which are happening and are proving to facilitate land rental is just one way of forward. And it comes together with a number of packages. And then machinery rental, a sort of helping farmers, also help facilitate part-time farming, especially in the mountainous areas where land consolidation is much harder. So basically, well, yes, if you have a machine, you have economies of scale, it's an indivisible input. But if you can let the machine go around, and actually you capture all the economies of scale of the machine, you have different coordination costs. Remember, that's where these plots, which were all together, helps actually. So it's interesting to look into how the farmers coordinate, and they are renting harvesters. Actually, there are now companies, apparently, which drive through the country, following the seasons. So not only are they capturing the economy of scale locally, they follow the season, maybe the harvest a couple of weeks later in the other, they put the machine in the truck and go to the next county and harvest there. So they basically spread out the machinery and capture the economies of scale that way. But it requires coordination cost among the farmers, and I think is a very fruitful area for research to better understand why that is happening. But I think machine rental is clearly an important part of facilitating this transition. So, in conclusion, I think supply is challenged to keep up with demand that comes from cereal, not the staples, not the rice, the wheat, but it really comes from the demand for meat and thus the demand for animal feed. There are major opportunities in the high-value crops, which a lot of export opportunities there as well, and that's happening. Food safety is an issue we'll need to take care of. China is working on that. But the new thing in all of this is the smallholder is challenged in sort of not because it's not competitive to produce on a small farm, but it's a challenge to make a living which is commensurate with what you can earn outside the farm. And I think how to handle that is a major challenge China is facing right now. Thank you.